Happy to be back. I'm Tulio Siragusa, broadcasting from Southern California. And today we have an awesome guest who is going to be talking to us about data, specifically the a disruption in the data broker model. I have Nick Jordan, who's the founder and CEO at Narrative, joining us, broadcasting from Brooklyn, New York. Hi, Nick. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. We're going to also be joined by Carlos Ponce, who's in Mexico City today, in just a little bit. Here he is. Hi, Carlos. Welcome back to the show. So, Nick, let's get started. But before we dive into this topic, which I think is going to be very interesting, let's get to know you a little bit. Please tell the audience a little bit about Nick Jordan.
Yeah, so I was born in upstate New York, Western New York, technically, south of Buffalo. I went to school up there. My degree's in computer science, and pretty quickly after I graduated, I moved to New York, although not Brooklyn. Brooklyn is for the older version of me, where I started working in the technology industry. That brought me out to the Bay Area, where I spent 5 years in Silicon Valley working at companies like Yahoo before coming back to Brooklyn about a decade ago. And so, really passionate about technology and all the different problems it can solve, and really have spent most of my professional life, thinking about that.
Great. Well, let's talk about Narrative. You're the founder of Narrative. Tell us a little bit about what gave birth to this idea. What was like that moment? I gotta do this.
I actually have a moment. I feel like some people make up the moment, but there was an actual moment. So
most people make it up.
Well, right. I swear to God, this is not made up. This everything I tell you today will be the truth. So I worked in product management roles in my previous companies that I hadn't started, but I was usually on the leadership team. And my previous company, we were a voracious consumer of data, and we would also sell data. And what we found was neither the buying or the selling of data was particularly easy. We had to staff up these massive teams to do it. And from the time that we wanted to go buy data until we could actually buy the stuff would take months and months and months. And when we were selling data, the same thing would happen. And it wasn't because there wasn't supply or demand. It was because there was so much friction between the buyers and the sellers. And there was a moment, a woman that worked on my team in my previous company, Dipali Shenoy is her name. She was basically put in charge of the data acquisition operations. And, I remember it as it being, dark clouds outside, raining, and her coming and to me crying and saying, there has to be a better way. This is just the hardest, most difficult thing in the world. I think I'm probably overselling that slightly. But she did come to me and she's like, this is just a fundamentally broken process. There's got to be a better way. And my initial reaction was to say, of course, there's a better way. Let's go find the company that's doing it, that solved this problem. And the more we looked, the less we found anyone that was actually taking this process and making it easier.
Well, this was probably also right around the time when in the ad tech space, the idea of the middle person was removed when RTB was introduced so that buyers and sellers could actually go direct. But so I see a lot of similarities into that. But before we go into the whole conversation about this, because we want to dig in and learn a lot more about you and Narrative and what you're doing, let's introduce the topic of the show today and kick it off. Carlos, please do that. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tulio, and thank you, Nick, for being with us today. Today, we're going to be speaking about data streaming and the end of the data broker model. So, in other words, we're going to be answering the question of can a disruptive new approach remove the pain of buying and selling data? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. First question for our guest. Nick, tell us, and the audience, of course, why did you choose this particular topic? Why did you feel it was relevant for this day and age?
Well, I mean, there's an overused phrase that data is the new oil, and I really don't like it because it just frankly is overused. But there's some truth to it. Almost every modern company is reliant on data in one way or another. And where it's like oil is that, they take it and they refine it and they create new products from it. So in the same way, oil could be turned into jet fuel or plastic or any, 1,000 other things. Data is really, really the same. That trend has just accelerated, over the last couple of the years, and definitely over the last decade. And so the solutions that existed 10 years ago really haven't kept up with the problem that companies are trying to solve today. And so it seems like the perfect topic to discuss, to sort of point out where where the supply chain may be broken today, and how a data streaming platform like the one that we've built can ultimately, fix those problems.
Now, Nick, would
Thank
you
you.
say that also part of the problem for a long time was that the brokers were the ones who sort of held all the keys to everything, right? There was a lot of power in having access and being able to be the go-to people for everything you needed, specifically around consumer data or any other kind of data for that matter. So, what has narrative done in terms of, you talk about a disruptive new approach? What has narrative done that has disrupted that model, and how?
Yeah, I mean, we've taken a technology approach where historically data brokers and other companies in what they call the information service industry, it's really been a sales and service driven model. And so, if you think about going to a data broker today, you're usually picking up the phone and calling someone. They ask you 100 questions. They then go back, talk to someone, and then there's just this long sort of service chain to get you what you're ultimately looking for. And we've said, well, why can't we automate all of those things? Why can't we add a technology layer that eliminates the need to have, 10 conversations with a business development person, and 5 conversations with an engineer, and 3 conversations with a lawyer or a finance person? And so, our approach is not dissimilar to what we see in a bunch of different industries, where you used to call a dispatcher to get a car sent to your house so you could go to the airport. Now you open up an app, and Uber or Lyft sends you one. You used to go to a travel agent to book your vacation. I think most people under a certain age probably have no idea what a travel agent even is these days, right? They've been replaced by a technology layer instead of a binder full of vacation ideas. And ultimately, we're just taking that principle and applying it to the data economy.
Nick, I have a question. And for those who are watching, who might not be who might not have a deep knowledge of the technical aspects of what's buying and selling data is, what I'd like to ask you is, who are your main clients? What are your spaces, your verticals that you serve?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty broad base. So one of the classes of data that are bought and sold on the platform are what I would broadly classify as consumer data. So something that represents some sort of consumer behavior. And so for that, you may have various companies that are trying to do marketing that would like to use that type of data, but you may also have hedge funds that are trying to understand consumer trends so they can find the next hot equity to buy and sell. And so, the data sometimes derives the use case, but sometimes a particular class of data can be used in a variety of different ways. But you may also be talking about sensor data from IoT devices, de-identified medical data, especially with COVID has become big. In agriculture technology, they're continuing to both generate and consume data in mass quantities. There's all these satellite companies that are now putting, low Earth orbit satellites up that are collecting data that they're ultimately selling. And so, we really see ourselves as a broad-based, generalized platform versus one that serves a very small niche.
One more. Thank you, Nick. As you know, well, you're a tech company. Our sponsor is a tech company, and tech companies recently, due to the pandemic, precisely, well, there's a lot of effervescence in technology. There's a lot of things going on, a lot of platforms. Would you say that your company or that narrative has experienced like the whole situation has really played a major role in its growth, or have you pivoted?
Yeah, there hasn't been a pivot. I mean, what was interesting about a company at our stage is, we really created a new category of software in the data streaming platform. And we raised a Series A at the beginning of the year, just before the pandemic. And that was sort of to go, have our coming out party where we could talk much more about the platform and how it could be used and leveraged. And the downside of the pandemic is we weren't at a stage where everyone was saying, I need to buy a data streaming platform. We weren't getting RFPs, by the dozens every day. Most of our sales that, before the pandemic were walking into an organization, showing them how we can make their lives easier, and then getting them to shift around some budget because they hadn't planned going into the year to license our software. And, the pandemic created a lot of uncertainty, and shifting budget around became a very hard thing to do. And so the early days, I think it was actually a struggle for us. I think the good news is it forced us to sort of double down on some of the technology bets that we were making. We had a little bit more time to focus on building the great technology. And then as we've done that, and as people have realized that the world has changed around them, like literally, that running your business based on tribal knowledge or based on what was true last month or last year is no longer a good bet. And so many companies have actually become much more forward thinking in terms of their data strategy, because they realize that the world might change on a dime, and the only way to really understand what's happening is through data. And so over the last quarter or two, it's actually been pretty good for us.
Thank you, Nick. Tulio.
Yeah, I can certainly see the major shift, not only in consumer but B2B, where you don't have the feet on the street, so to speak, getting the insights and input directly from customers and such. So it becomes more important to make smart decisions by having access to data. So my question really relates to this shift, right? So historically, you had brokers that had relationships and knowledge built in over many years that, had the ability to make the matchmaking, if you will, for what you needed, right? So you're a buyer, you'd say, I need this. The broker knows a few sellers that have it, and they make the connection. So there was a bit of a concierge built into that kind of model, right? So yours is buyers and sellers connecting directly to each other. So, but how do you actually facilitate matchmaking the right kind of seller to the right buyer? What are you doing to enabling that, which has normally been a relationship kind of a thing?
Yeah. So again, we've taken a technology approach to it. So you think of our technology working this way. The sellers are pushing all of their data into their narrative instance of the platform, and then they're setting up the same rules that they would set up if they were selling their data directly. They set up their rate card, they decide who's competitive and they don't want to work with, or they want to price a particular type of data or attribute differently than another type. But think of it as them setting up the their business rules around data monetization. You then have a buyer that comes in and basically does the same thing. Here's the type of data I'm looking for, here's my budget. Here are, maybe I want to enrich information about my current customers. And so here's my current customers. I only want to buy data if it matches one of my existing customers. And then, in a very boring explanation of what our technology does, we almost act as an escrow service between the two sides, right? Does the seller want to sell to this buyer, and do their prices align? And does the seller have the data the buyer wants to buy? And if all of those things are true, we basically facilitate that transaction. What's interesting is it doesn't have to be a one-to-one transaction, right? If the buyer says, I'm looking to buy, a particular class of data, on my existing customers, and there's 30 sellers that all have that data, the buyer can work with all 30 without doing any additional work. And so from a buyer's perspective, they're getting sort of all of the incrementality, all of the available data that may be in the market without having to have a dozen conversations or 24 conversations. And from a seller's perspective, especially sellers that maybe historically wouldn't have gotten that deal before, they now have access to a bunch of buyers because we've removed all of the friction between the two sides.
Are you getting some traction with both buyers and sellers? What's been any experience in terms of pushback to adopt this?
There hasn't been a ton of pushback. I think the hardest part was the early days of the company is like, how do you get a buyer when you don't have any sellers, and how do you get a seller when you don't have any buyers?
Right.
And this was always implicit in our model, but we de-risked it, especially for the sell side. We said, listen, we don't have any rights to your data. We can't sell your data, right? You're setting up your rate card, your business rules. And so even if no one buys your data in month 1 or month 2 or month 3, other than a little bit of opportunity cost of having to integrate with us and do some of those things, like you can really see us as a channel more so than anything else. And so with that, we were able to bring a couple dozen sellers onto the platform, literally making no money for them at all. And then once we had a couple of dozen sellers on the platform, it became much easier to go talk to buyers and say, hey, you were about to go have conversations with 10 of these 24 sellers. Wouldn't it be easier if you could sort of cut out the need to have 3 months worth of back and forth, and you could just buy their data by clicking a button? And that made it really easy to get the buyers on at that point.
Are buyers able to buy fragments of data from multiple sellers?
Correct. So,
oh wow,
as a nerd, the most interesting thing about the platform to me is the transactions, and there's some nuance to this because we support fire hoses, we support all sorts of transaction models. But my favorite is the transaction is actually on a single row of data, right? And so instead of saying I'm going to buy a data set with 100 million rows of data in it, you're actually buying a single row of data for what is an infinitesimal amount of money, tenths of a penny. Oftentimes. And so you're able to filter at that level. I want to buy this row from this provider. I don't want to buy this row. I want to buy this row. And what you're ultimately getting is a data set. None of our customers are buying a single row of data. They're still buying millions or hundreds of millions of rows. But the data set they're getting is entirely bespoke because of this microtransaction model where every decision is made at the row level and not at the entire data set level.
Brilliant.
Nick, I have a question. On the business side of the equation, because my mind is not that of an engineer, so I don't think like one. So on the business side, well, how would you say that, what types of, let's call them spaces or verticals or data-driven companies have you seen that are more open to embracing your value proposition?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a more direct answer to the question, but in some ways, the easiest way to find the companies that are good buy-side partners for us is if they have data science teams. Like if you were to go look at their job board, if they're hiring data engineers and data scientists and product managers that have data somewhere in their responsibilities, that means that they're actively embracing and expanding sort of their broad data strategy. Mm-hmm. That tends to be younger companies, still large companies. Think of Postmates and DoorDash. Sort of going public. Big large enterprises, but companies that were born in the last decade. A lot of direct-to-consumer brands sort of fall within that. And so I'd say that's one broad category that we do really well in. And then there's another one, which is just technology companies. Right, so you look at these big, technology platforms in different spaces. I mean, almost by definition, they're very data forward, and I think all of those companies in both categories sort of start out their data journey just assuming that the data will be easy to get. Right, like we talk about data like it's this monolithic asset, like it's a widget. Like I'm going to go buy a widget. Like I'm going to go to the widget store and I'm going to pay $10 for a widget, and then I'll have my widgets and I'll be on my way. And data. A million times more complicated than that, if not an infinite time more complicated than that. And so pretty quickly after they do that, like to get a single deal done, in my previous company, if we were doing our job well, it would take us 6 months and probably 1,000 people hours to get a single deal done. And we had aspirations to do dozens of these a year. And so, I think once you've lived that pain and then you have a conversation with us, the light bulb goes off pretty quickly.
Great.
So let's quickly recap a little bit. So the platform is vertical agnostic because you essentially are enabling a transaction between buyer and seller. It doesn't really matter whether it's consumer data or IoT data or sensor data. It doesn't really matter. It's zeros and ones, right? So but you're able to put rules and establish the sets and parameters of what is important to you, and you're able to buy it at the line level. So I can buy multiple sets of data from multiple sellers, which serves my needs as a buyer way more than I could ever do in the past, even just working with broker that might need to broker multiple deals. Does it also enable me to get faster and smarter about how I make the data executable once I have it? Because I'm now getting it down to a much narrower scope. So have you seen use cases where some buyers are now using this to be faster in terms of executing their campaigns, for example, or other decisions that that they need to obviously build algorithms around. Is it enabling that faster as well? And how is it doing that?
Yeah, it is. I mean, where we see it most in the most pronounced way is actually with data science teams, and you know, data science is also a term that's thrown around quite a bit these days. But you know, the part of it that I like is the science part, because you know the traditional scientific method is you have a hypothesis about something, and then you go test that hypothesis, and you know you're happy whether it's right or wrong because you've learned something, and then you iterate on that, right? You go test another hypothesis, and over time you build out a theory or whatever it might be. You know, when it comes to data science, you know, if you have a hypothesis historically that a particular type of data could improve your machine learning model or your AI algorithm or just the predictions that you were going to make, like you then had to wait 6 months for someone to go find you that data so you could test the hypothesis, and that's just not the speed that business goes at today. And so where I think this has really changed the game is, you know, I can now say, hey, I think my model would be better if I could pull in air quality sensor data, because I think, you know, air quality sensor data might be correlated with, you know, some sort of economic behavior. Historically, it might take you forever to test that. You know, with air quality sensor data available on our platform, you could go, you know, buy a nominal amount of that, test it in your model. If it proves to be your hypothesis was true, say, okay, now I want more of that stuff. I want to, you know, like now feed the machine. If it turns out I was wrong, I wasted a day or, you know, or maybe a week, depending on how long it took to train the model. But now I can come up with another hypothesis, and I can ultimately end up building better systems instead of, you know, this very slow iteration process that, you know, goes over the course of months or years.
Interesting. I mean, I've seen over the years many platforms, specifically in marketing automation, where the technology can do amazing things, but you don't have access to the data that you make to do the permutations, to do the number of tests you need to do. You don't have access to it in a timely fashion. It kind of becomes, you know, like having a Ferrari but on a dirt road, right? So,
Yeah.
so, so are you also seeing companies that provide services, you know, marketing automation companies, for example, participating in this kind of platform, or do you see a use case for them to participate so that they can provide a better service to their end clients who might, you know, where they might be acting as an agency, for example? You see that in the future as well, or do you have use cases right now for that? How would that work?
We do that a little bit right now. Right now, it tends to be, you know, we will have a channel partnership with the marketing automation company. And so when they, you know, bring on a customer, when there's a specific use case that you know necessitates data, they access the data through us, you know, very quickly, right? And very quickly, you know, from the time they have the idea until the data is flowing into their platform can be measured in you know, in an hour or two. And then they can ultimately change that. They have full control over it. We're moving to a model where we would actually love to have, you know, our capabilities embedded directly in those systems. And so in some ways you're a customer of a marketing automation company, and you say, you know, I'm about to send out a promotion about getting a free bottle of champagne when you stay at my hotel, but I'd really only like to send this promotion to people that like champagne, right? So if you were able to buy data about people that like champagne, execute the actual promotion, and have that whole thing be self-contained within the tool that you already use. And in some ways, you know, narrative is the intel inside in that example, but the end customer doesn't even know that narrative is kind of powering that transaction. That's one of our long-term growth models.
And that is how David slays Goliath. I love that. That's brilliant, because there's obviously big players in that space right now. What a fantastic way to disrupt that by embedding a piece of technology into something that's already out there.
Yeah, it actually goes the other way as well. I mean, we don't do anything to the data, right? Like I like to say that we're not smart enough to know how to, you know, predict the weather, or if a stock's going to go up or down, or if someone's going to click on an ad. We just, you know, make the data available so someone can make that prediction or someone can build their model. But, you know, we do quite often, people will come to us and say, you know, I would like to buy this data, but for it to really be valuable, something needs to be done to it. And so an easy example is location data is one of the data sets that are available on our platform. And so most of the location data is a timestamp and a latitude and a longitude. So, you know, it's literally indecipherable by humans. And they say, you know, I would love to buy this location data, but I need to know the person was standing in an Apple store not that they were standing at 78.321 by 120.774. They say, can you enrich the data with a point of interest? And that's just, again, I would say we're not smart enough to do that. And that's, I'm underselling how smart we are. It's not really our core value prop. And so what we're doing is we're creating an app platform that sits on top of narrative. And so if you're a company that can turn a latitude and longitude into a point of interest, or you can validate that a piece of data is correct, or if you can even build machine learning models on top of data that's on our platform, instead of someone having to buy data and then ship it off to someone and then have them ship it back, you could just install an app on top of our platform, pay that app provider a fee, and now they will enrich the location data with point of interest or any other number of use cases. And so, I think we want to expand by embedding our services, anywhere that they're useful, but we also want other companies to be able to sit on top of our pipes and again, remove as much friction as possible from these buyers and sellers that oftentimes are going to want, some enrichment or value add layered on top of the data itself.
Brilliant. I can see why data scientists love the platform, because you're enabling, with those kinds of capabilities, enabling them to have a one-stop shop, if you will, for everything they need to make the data executable or usable, by having a marketplace where people can enrich the data sets right in the marketplace. Congratulations. Sounds like you're off to the races for something that could have a lot of legs and a lot of growth opportunity. We're coming up on time shortly. Want to shift a little bit about what it's been like for you personally building this business. Was this your first startup? I think you mentioned this was your first startup.
The first one that I founded. I've worked at startups before, although founding startups is a bit of a different beast than
right. So curious to any words of wisdom, things you've learned about yourself in the process of building this out for the first time. Perhaps there's some folks listening, working for a big company, who have a great idea, see a problem, and they want to start a business, but they're a little sitting on the fence. Any words of wisdom you have for them? Besides, don't do it.
They're talking to the wrong person, because I'm going to tell them not to do it.
Don't do it.
What I usually tell people when they ask for advice is like, don't listen to anyone's advice, because every situation's unique, every situation's different. Or if you do listen to the advice, figure out how it applies to you. Like it's you can't verbatim take something I say or anyone else says and say, okay, now I've got the playbook. If there was a playbook, everyone would be running it. You have to be committed to the problem. It can't it has to be something that you wake up in the morning and you're excited to go do. If it's something that you think is a big business, but it's not really your area of interest, like it's probably not the right thing. And in some ways, it's like a marriage, right? You can't decide, especially if you take investment, you can't decide just 6 months in, 12 months in, I'm just not going to do this anymore. Like you're in it for the long haul, and no matter how much you prepare, how many people you talk to, you don't really know what it's like until you get into it. And so, I guess I'd give the same advice I would give someone getting married. Like, make sure you're in it for the long haul, because it's a commitment.
Great. Thanks for sharing that with us. Thanks for being with us today. Very excited for what Narrative is up to. We wish you a lot of success. We will definitely stay in touch with you. We want to hear some more use cases as the years go by. Stay with us as we go off the air shortly. But before we do that, we've got one more show tomorrow, right, Carlos?
Indeed.
What do we got coming up?
We got tomorrow. We're going to be speaking with John Saby, the CTO of a technology company that serves the oil and the environmental. How can I say this? The oil and environmental, with an environmental focus or concern, called ProCep, and the topic is going to be innovation, driving advancements in oil and gas processing. So that's tomorrow, right here on DojoLIVE at 1 p.m. Pacific. And folks, if you're watching, just remember that starting in January next year, the DojoLIVE conversations are going to be held at 12 p.m. noon time Pacific. Just make a note of that and be safe.
See you soon.